In early 2014, June Myers settled back on the exam table, adjusting the paper gown around her increasingly round belly. June was 26 weeks pregnant, and because she was 43 years old, her pregnancy was considered high risk for both the mother and her unborn child. She and her husband Philip had gone through a few unsuccessful pregnancies, but even though everything seemed to be going all right with this one, June was still nervous. The doctor told her it was just a matter of numbers. Any woman 35 years or older has an increased risk of miscarriage, genetic disorders, and pregnancy complications such as premature delivery. So June had diligently attended regular appointments with her medical team to make sure she and the baby were okay. Thankfully, so far the only problem June had experienced was high blood sugar, and that was something she could manage with medication. She prayed that her luck would hold, and that today would be just another routine checkup, and another chance to peek at their baby, a little girl. As the ultrasound technician squeezed some cold gel onto June's belly, she felt goosebumps break out on her arms. Philip took her hand and squeezed it, and then nodded his head towards the computer screen. There was their baby, her tiny features displayed in black and white while they listened to her rapid, echoey heartbeat on the monitor. The sight of this made June forget all about feeling cold as she focused on her perfect daughter. But then June noticed the technician was frowning. The technician adjusted the ultrasound wand on June's abdomen to get a better look, and then tapped out a few keystrokes on the computer next to her. Then she stood up and excused herself, telling June and Philip she needed to check something with the doctor. While they waited, June could not help but feel totally anxious, thinking something was wrong. And then a minute later, when the doctor walked through the door, June just blurted out, "What is it? What's wrong?" The doctor pulled up one of the ultrasound images on the screen, showing the baby's head. Then the doctor traced her finger along a thick white line that ran straight down the middle of their baby's brain. Typically, she explained, when a fetus is developing in the womb, there is a small bubble in the middle of this line. Doctors look for this bubble because it's considered a general indicator of normal brain development. June searched the long, unbroken line that her doctor was pointing to, feeling dazed. She couldn't see a bubble. The doctor continued in a measured tone. This scan could be nothing, but it could also indicate an abnormality in their baby's brain development. However, the doctor said there was only so much they could see on an ultrasound. She needed to run a fetal MRI scan for a complete, detailed picture of their child's brain. They could do the test as soon as the next day. June nodded weakly as Philip put an arm around her. The doctor hit a few more keystrokes, and the computer spit out the small rectangular ultrasound picture of their baby in profile. She handed the pictures to June with a reassuring smile. She told June it was all just a precaution and not to worry until they had all the information. June smiled back and nodded, but in her head, she was not feeling so sure. The following day, June lay back on a patient table in another cold medical room. A technician's voice squawked through the speaker. They were ready to begin. June heard a mechanical whirring as the table she was lying on gradually slid her inside a giant MRI machine. The voice came on again and reminded her to lay as still as possible so they could get a clear image. But June's heart was pounding, shaking her entire chest. She was so worried about her child. The voice came on again and reassured her that plenty of people feel uncomfortable being enclosed in the machine. But if she could just stay calm, focus on slow, steady breaths, they'd get her out as soon as they could. Then, the MRI was suddenly alive with sound, a series of insistent metallic buzzing and heavy rhythmic thunks. But June's anxiety had nothing to do with the claustrophobia, or even the test itself, really. She wanted to have this MRI. She was just terrified of the results. The next 30 minutes would likely dictate her baby's future. But in between the waves of dread, June felt a small kick coming from inside her belly, and then another, just a bit harder. She had no idea what was going on in there, but June knew that her daughter was sending her a message. Until a definitive test said otherwise, June was going to assume that her baby was happy and healthy. June took a deep breath, then slowly exhaled, staying focused on that little foot kicking her from the inside. Two days after the MRI, June and her husband Philip sat in the doctor's office waiting for the image results. June was a nervous wreck. Despite her best efforts to stay calm, she hadn't been able to think about anything other than what those images might show her. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door, and the doctor entered. June immediately scanned the doctor's face to see if maybe she was upset or worried, but the doctor was all smiles. Once she sat down, she told June and Philip that everything looked great. The MRI images showed that the baby's brain was developing normally. If the missing bubble was a real problem, it would have affected other parts of the brain, but that wasn't the case. June's doctor promised they would keep a close eye on the baby for the rest of the pregnancy, but for now, there was nothing to worry about. June and Philip were so relieved. 10 weeks later, June gave birth via C-section to a beautiful baby girl. Lucy weighed 6 pounds 11 ounces and measured 19.4 inches long. She had hazel eyes and a full head of light brown hair. June and Philip felt an instant sense of calm come over them now that all those pregnancy worries were behind them. Lucy was just fine. However, when the hospital's pediatrician stopped by June's hospital room to check in, he brought a new puzzling update. Lucy's head was unusually large for a baby her size and weight. This is called macrocephaly, and it applies to any baby whose head size is in the 97th percentile or higher. Now, Lucy didn't look at all abnormal, but her head circumference was just over 14 inches, making it bigger than 99% of other newborn girls. June immediately felt the familiar creep of anxiety prickling her neck. But the doctor explained that until they knew the cause, Lucy's larger-than-normal head was just an unusual measurement. Sometimes it's completely benign. Babies can inherit a big head, just like they inherit other physical traits, like eye color. However, to rule out something more severe, like a tumor or a brain bleed, the doctor needed to perform an ultrasound to examine Lucy's brain. The following morning, June held her breath as a nurse wheeled the bassinet out of the room, taking Lucy to her imaging appointment. Philip slept in a chair in the corner. He and June had both been up all night with the baby, and he'd finally just given in to the exhaustion. But June felt wide awake. An hour crawled by before the nurse finally returned, and she'd hardly parked the wheels on the bassinet before June had scooped Lucy up in her arms. Philip stirred awake at the two women talking and joined them at June's bedside. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and the obstetrician poked his head in the room, and he was smiling. He gave the chart another quick glance and confirmed that the ultrasound ruled out any abnormalities. Lucy's macrocephaly was benign, which meant somewhere in Philip and June's gene pool, there was a relative with a large head circumference, a trait that had clearly been passed down to their daughter. The doctor would monitor it over the next few months, but otherwise, they could all go home tomorrow with a clean bill of health. 6 months later, June held Lucy on her lap in another doctor's office while an ophthalmologist, or eye doctor, performed an exam on Lucy. Lucy squirmed away from the bright light shining in her face, and she cried in irritation. June apologized to the doctor, soothing Lucy and settling her down. But the doctor reassured her that this reaction was actually a good thing. Next, the doctor pulled out a plastic toy duck and showed it to Lucy, holding it up in front of her face. He gave it a quick squeeze, making it quack, which immediately caught the baby's attention. And as the baby stared intently at the toy, the doctor slowly moved the duck to the right and then over to the left, to the very outside edges of Lucy's field of vision. And as he did this, his brow furrowed, confirming June's suspicion that something was wrong. Over the last few months, June had noticed that Lucy was not making direct eye contact anymore. Instead of responding to her mother's voice or watching whatever she was doing, Lucy always seemed to look down, even when her mother knew she'd gotten her baby's attention. It felt to June like Lucy wanted to look at her, but somehow couldn't. Even more concerning, sometimes Lucy's eyes pointed in different directions. One eye could be looking directly ahead, clearly focused on something, while the other sort of drifted off to the side. And that's exactly what happened when the doctor passed the toy duck back and forth in front of Lucy's face. Only one of her eyes followed the movement, while the other started looking toward the side. The doctor told June that this kind of eye misalignment, known as strabismus, can happen for a variety of reasons, ranging from, no big deal issues to severe problems. The doctor explained that depending on what was causing her eyes to misalign, they might be able to correct Lucy's vision with simple things like giving her glasses or by having her wear an eye patch for a while. Perhaps her eye muscles were simply weaker on one side and just needed a little extra training to do their job properly. But first, in order to rule out the more severe causes behind this, the doctor needed to dilate Lucy's pupils and check the interior structures with a lighted, magnified lens. June held her daughter tightly across her chest, keeping her baby's chubby, squirmy arms out of the way, while the doctor quickly swooped in with medicated eye drops. Lucy frowned at the sensation, not quite sure yet if she wanted to cry. Before she could decide, the doctor deftly distracted her with a few quacks from the toy duck. Once the eye drops had taken effect and Lucy's pupils were now wide open and huge, June held her daughter in place on her lap in the now dimly lit room, and the doctor adjusted the light dial on his scope, cooing at Lucy to get her attention. However, when the doctor pointed the light toward one of Lucy's eyes, he suddenly became very serious. He stayed quiet as he checked the other eye too. Then he went back to the first, looking even longer this time, shining the light through a tinted magnifying lens that he held right in front of Lucy's face. Then the doctor sat back in his chair. June couldn't read his face in the dim light, but he hadn't said anything in almost 5 minutes, and so instinctively, she asked him what was wrong. The doctor flipped the overhead lights back on and looked at June with an unmistakable gravity. Lucy's strabismus was not caused by weak muscles. Instead, it was a symptom of a much more serious and dangerous condition. A few days later, June and Philip sat at a conference table in one of the hospital's meeting rooms. They were flanked by a team of medical specialists who were reviewing their findings on Lucy's condition. June dutifully wrote down all their disturbing updates on a yellow legal pad. Keeping the record at least gave her something to do with her hands. During the eye exam, the ophthalmologist could see that Lucy had significant swelling at the back of both her eyes, where they connect with the main nerve that leads to the brain. This condition, known as papilledema, was a serious warning sign since it often means that there is too much pressure inside the skull. That ophthalmologist had recommended that Lucy undergo a series of scans, including an MRI and a CT, to look for a reason for this increased pressure. Now, another doctor called up the results of those scans on his computer, and he projected an enormous image of Lucy's eye up on a monitor. He explained to June and Philip that these images showed that Lucy had too much cerebrospinal fluid in her brain, a condition called hydrocephalus. The doctor admitted to the parents that what they had been told before about Lucy's head was wrong. She did not inherit a big head from a distant relative. The pressure from the extra fluid had made her head grow larger than normal, and unfortunately, the pressure affected more than just Lucy's head size. The fluid in her skull was slowly crushing Lucy's brain. Left untreated, this increased intracranial pressure could lead to strokes, seizures, and brain damage in the coming years. If enough pressure built up, it could be fatal. The doctors wanted to place a tube, known as a shunt, in Lucy's skull that would allow the excess fluid to drain, relieving the pressure inside of her skull. Once that happened, her head would likely get smaller, and her risk of brain damage would plummet. In addition, relieving the pressure in her skull would also resolve her eye problems. The doctor told June that inserting this shunt was a short and simple operation, but still, June hated the thought of making Lucy undergo brain surgery. However, she didn't see any other options. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her only child. And so she and Philip asked the doctors to schedule this procedure as soon as possible. Five months later, in the spring of 2015, June was sitting at her desk, deep in research mode. She scanned through her notes until she found the exact terminology she was looking for, and then she entered it into the search bar on her internet browser and clicked. June had begun taking notes on her daughter's condition out of necessity. It was a way to capture and later translate all the complicated medical terminology she was hearing. But now, her record keeping on her daughter felt like her duty as the child's mother. She looked over from her laptop to Lucy, who was now 11 months old. Lucy was on her activity mat, which was decorated with brightly colored ribbons and sensory squares. There were also a few plush toys scattered within the baby's reach. But Lucy just sat there in the middle, her head drooping like it was too heavy for her to hold it up. The shunt procedure had worked, and just like the doctor hoped, Lucy's head had gotten smaller and her eyes were no longer misaligned. But now Lucy had a new problem. She was falling behind other kids her age in reaching key milestones. She should have been trying to take her first steps and pulling herself up to stand. Instead, she was still barely able to crawl. Most children her age were able to say a few simple words like mama and dada, and they imitate the way people talk, even if it comes out as babble. June could tell her daughter did understand a lot of what June said to her, but so far, her daughter had not made any attempts to talk back. June closed her computer and got down on the floor next to her daughter. And as soon as she did, she noticed that against the light-colored blanket, there was something odd on Lucy's legs that stood out. She had these thin, dark lines running from her knees to her ankle. June thought to herself, have these been here for a while, or are these new? She examined the lines, running her finger over them. They didn't seem raised or painful. They were just a slightly different color than her skin, so they stood out. But she made a mental note to ask the pediatrician about them. Then, June picked up one of the plushies and danced it across the mat and up one of Lucy's chubby legs. The child smiled, but Lucy didn't try to grab the toy. To June's surprise, her daughter's head lolled further to the side until eventually she started to tip over, unable to support herself. June grabbed her baby before she fell over and hit her head. As she pulled Lucy tightly into her chest, she thought to herself, enough was enough. Clearly, something was wrong, and she didn't care how many doctors she needed to see. June knew she could no longer stand by as her daughter clearly receded further and further from the world. Two months later, June checked in with the front desk at a pediatric neurology clinic. Lucy was now 13 months old, and she was scheduled for an electroencephalogram, or EEG, to measure her brain activity. If there was something malfunctioning in Lucy's brain, the EEG should be able to locate what area was affected and how severely. June held her daughter in her lap and tried to distract her as a nurse attached almost 24 electrodes to her daughter's scalp with a gritty, sticky paste. By the end, with all these wires coming off her head, Lucy looked like something out of a horror movie. The nurse placed a mesh cap over the jumble of wires on Lucy's head to keep her from pulling them off during the test or otherwise disrupting the connection. Each electrode measured a specific region of Lucy's brain, responding to the electrical activity of her neurons. Hoping to keep her daughter still, June let Lucy rest against her chest and told her a story, making it up on the spot. Once everything was hooked up, June watched the monitor that transmitted Lucy's brainwaves. She hoped that somewhere in those lines there was an answer to her daughter's problems. The next day, June got a phone call from the neurologist with the test results. Everything looked fine, he said. Lucy's brain seemed to be completely healthy and functional. June was relieved. She was terrified that her child was secretly suffering brain damage. But at the same time, she still didn't understand why Lucy was not developing like other kids her age if her brain really was okay. There had to be an answer, and June was determined to find it. A year and a half later, in late 2016, June sat inside the neurologist's office, trying to hold back her disappointment. She forced herself to remain focused and keep taking notes as the doctor explained Lucy's latest results. It was only the latest in a long series of tests, as Lucy's doctor had tried to gather as much information about Lucy as possible. She'd taken x-rays of every bone in Lucy's body, hoping to find some physical abnormalities, like a protruding forehead or low muscle tone, that could be a symptom of a bone disease. But there was nothing out of the ordinary on the x-rays. The doctor had also run a nutritional study, a hearing test, and a fresh round of MRIs and ultrasounds. She had also tested Lucy for a wide variety of genetic conditions, running panels on her blood and skin. And when all those came back negative, she had Lucy's DNA mapped and sequenced. But each time, the doctor got the same result. Everything was basically normal, and today's visit was no different. June looked over at her daughter, still strapped into her stroller. Lucy was now 3 years old, and yet she still could not walk or talk. She lagged behind kids her age in everything from social skills to coordination. June closed her notebook feeling crestfallen. This was the end of the road. After so many months and countless tests, it didn't seem like there were any options left. But June was surprised to learn that the doctor actually had one more card to play here. She was going to refer Lucy to the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, a group that specialized in treating seemingly impossible conditions like Lucy's. If anyone could find the answer, it was them. In May of 2018, Dr. Linda Chen sat behind her desk trying to wolf down some lunch while reviewing the case file for her latest patient, Lucy. Dr. Chen was an investigator for the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. She studied the long list of diagnostic tests that had been performed so far, and they had all come back apparently normal. But obviously there was something else going on here. But taking on a challenging case like Lucy's was what Dr. Chen did best. Just then, a nurse buzzed through the intercom. Lucy and her mother were waiting in an exam room. Dr. Chen took a final bite, gathered up the chart, and headed out to greet her patient. She knocked lightly on the exam room door, then stepped inside and introduced herself. Dr. Chen immediately noticed the thick ledger of personal notes sitting on the chair next to June. She realized this mother's research was 3 times the size of Lucy's official chart. Dr. Chen asked June to place Lucy on the patient table so she could begin her examination. After she had, Dr. Chen got a good look at Lucy. Lucy was small for her age, and her arms and legs were thin, lacking muscle tone. Dr. Chen lifted up one of Lucy's arms, and immediately she noticed something. There were these straight lines running down her arm. They were faint, but distinct. Dr. Chen noticed that Lucy also had these same lines on her legs as well. Dr. Chen looked at Lucy's back, where she found another series of these lines that branched upward. They were all V-shaped, each perfectly centered at the middle of her spine. The way the bands of color repeated along her back, they almost looked like tiger stripes. Dr. Chen walked away from Lucy and grabbed her chart and began reading over the notes. As she was doing this, June asked her, what do these stripes mean? June said the neurologist had told her that these lines were normal. Dr. Chen disagreed. She said these tiger stripes were actually an invaluable clue and could be the key to finally providing answers to the family. She said she just needed to run one more test. Dr. Chen carefully took a sample of skin from one of the lines on Lucy's back and then sent it off to the lab to see if her hunch was right. And it would turn out it was. Finally, after 4 years of searching for answers, June and her husband Philip finally knew what was wrong with their little girl. Lucy had a genetic condition so rare that there were fewer than 100 documented cases worldwide. This condition, called Smith-Kingsmore syndrome, is caused by a mutation in the gene that controls how cells grow during development. In Lucy's case, the gene, known as the mTOR gene, was not shutting off properly, which caused certain cells to keep multiplying when they should have stopped. Dr. Chen suspected that Lucy had this genetic condition when she noticed the tiger stripes on Lucy's back, called Blaschko's lines. Every fetus has Blaschko's lines, but they are usually almost invisible. Blaschko's lines become clearly visible only if there is a genetic mutation that causes an excess of skin pigmentation to be produced while the baby is developing in the womb. And that's exactly what happened to Lucy. And since the brain forms at the same time as the skin, it's likely that the mutation that caused the baby's stripes also affected the brain as well. Once Lucy's genetic disease was finally pinpointed, Dr. Chen was able to start treating her with a drug that specifically blocks the mTOR gene from generating excess cells. Following this treatment, Lucy started to thrive almost immediately, learning how to walk and talk, and finally catching up on her developmental skills. However, the medication was not a cure for all of Lucy's developmental delays, and so treatment is still an ongoing process. Douglas loved sitting out on the front porch of her neat gray house in Wadsworth, Ohio. Settled comfortably into one of the white wicker chairs that overlooked her 6-foot-high rhododendron bushes with their clusters of purple flowers, she knew all of her neighbors by name. And she also knew by heart the daily rhythms of this quiet street in a town of fewer than 2,400 residents. Wadsworth was one of those tiny middle American towns that you could find pictured on a postcard. And since Margaret and her husband had arrived in this town back in 1959, not much had changed. Now, in the early spring of 2018, Margaret was 98 years old, and the chilly April air was still keeping her inside. But even though Margaret lived alone these days, she had plenty of wonderful memories to keep her company, along with regular visits from a few close relatives and from a few of the neighbors who had become her good friends. Margaret had been born in 1919, just 1 year after World War I had come to a bloody close. By the time Margaret was just 25 years old, she had already lived through Prohibition, which was a 13-year-long ban on the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol in the United States, and she'd also lived through the Roaring Twenties and the Age of Jazz, which was a period in the 1920s and the 1930s. On December 6, 1941, Margaret and her family had listened in shock to the first news reports about the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor that catapulted the United States into World War II. And it was after World War II ended in 1945 that Margaret, at the age of 39, met and married her husband, Donald Douglas, a World War II U.S. Army veteran. For her whole life, Margaret had been a person who held firm opinions and wasn't afraid to share them with the world. And in her husband, Donald, Margaret had found the perfect match. Once they were married and settled into their 3-bedroom house in Wadsworth, together they bucked convention. Instead of having children, they centered their lives around each other, on travel, and on their careers. Margaret loved her job in nearby Akron, Ohio, where she worked at O'Neill's, which was one of the biggest and most glamorous department stores in the state. As for Donald, he proudly told people he worked at the Ohio Match Company, the world's largest producer of wooden and paper matches. And during the 41 years that the couple was married, they would live through the ups and downs of history together. The Civil Rights Movement, the first moonwalk, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the hippie movement of the 1960s, the age of rock and roll, and the Gulf War in 1991. When Donald passed away in May of 2000 at the age of 80, Margaret, who would turn 81 that year, chose to carry on living the kind of life that she and Donald had enjoyed as a couple. Her first decision was to remain right where she was, living in the house at 359 Portage Street in Wadsworth that held so many happy memories for her and her late husband. She might not have Donald by her side anymore, but, as her nephew Howard Leisure and his wife Cindy knew, Margaret had never been a quitter, and she'd always had this wonderful appetite for life. Over the next couple of decades, Margaret, who was now a widow, spent most of her time socializing with friends or gardening or reading books or watching TV, and she also spent a lot of time watching from her front porch one procession after another of neighborhood kids growing from toddlers to teenagers. Even in 2018, when Margaret was 98 years old, she still kept busy and enjoyed good health. Despite spending more and more time inside of her home, she still cared very much about her physical appearance, she kept up with the news, and she still very much looked forward to her regularly scheduled appointments with her hairdresser. Margaret's philosophy on life was simple. The world changed, and so she needed to change right along with it. On the morning of Thursday, April 5th of 2018, Margaret woke up and made her way to the front door to collect her newspaper. When she opened the door, she saw gray clouds in the sky and felt the chilly spring air blow across her face. She could already tell she would not be spending any time outdoors that day. Her body just could not handle the cold anymore. So, after getting dressed and eating her breakfast, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair in the living room and read a book and also watched some TV. She made 2 more light meals for herself that day, taking her time after each one to wash and dry her dishes, and she also set aside a few bills and notices that she knew she would need to get to in the next couple of days. As it grew dark outside, Margaret climbed the steps to the second floor of her house and got herself ready for bed. After washing up and putting on her nightdress, she went back down the stairs and curled up on the couch to read a bit more of her book and catch a little more TV before going to sleep. A little while later, as snowflakes fell outside of her window, Margaret decided that she was so cozy right there in her warm living room that she would just sleep down there on her couch that night. After turning off the TV and setting her book on the table nearby, Margaret snuggled down into her pillow and closed her eyes. Before she actually fell asleep, it hadn't even crossed her mind to get up and go make sure the front and back doors of her house were locked. She had lived in that house for more than 70 years and had stopped locking the doors a long time ago. 3 days later, at 9 a.m. on Monday, April 9th, the Wadsworth Police Department got a call from Margaret's nephew, Howard Leisure, who lived in a town just outside of Wadsworth about 40 minutes away. Howard told police that the day before, one of Margaret's neighbors had noticed newspapers were piling up against her front door, and when he, Howard, had tried calling her, she had not picked up, and considering her age, he was concerned about her. So, police immediately sent a patrol officer to 359 Portage Street for a welfare check. When officers arrived at Margaret's house, they found the front door was unlocked, so they stepped inside the residence and called out for Margaret. But the house was silent. They began searching the property, but there was no sign of a disturbance, nor was there any sign of Margaret, except that her walker, which she took everywhere with her, was still neatly tucked behind a well-used armchair in the living room. Finally, after searching the whole house and finding nothing, the police called back to their station and filed a missing person report. Then, the police who had done the search contacted Howard and his wife to inform them of the situation and to ask them to come to Wadsworth to assist in the search for Margaret. While police waited for Howard and Cindy to arrive at the house, they spoke with some neighbors who had gathered outside, and they would tell the police that the last time they had actually physically seen Margaret was a few days earlier on Thursday, April 5th. By late afternoon, Howard and Cindy had arrived at Margaret's house, and after speaking with police, they quickly walked up the front stairs and into Margaret's home. Inside, the first thing that Howard noticed was that the small red wallet that his aunt always carried with her or left on the little table next to her favorite armchair was missing. And a few minutes later, Howard opened the small downstairs closet, thinking maybe Margaret had left the wallet inside of a coat pocket that was hung up inside of that closet. But instead of finding Margaret's clothes hung neatly on hangers like they would normally be, the closet was a jumble of clothes piled on top of his aunt's vacuum cleaner on the ground. Peeking out from the bottom of the pile, Howard spotted one of the slippers his aunt often wore. Stooping down, Howard reached out and he grabbed it. Seconds later, the police and Cindy would hear Howard let out a scream of pure horror. They ran from the living room and found Howard on the ground, recoiling in shock and pointing at the open closet in front of him. Within minutes, there were dozens of police and emergency vehicles outside of 359 Portage Street. As neighbors looked out their windows to see what was happening on an otherwise cold and quiet Monday evening, a patrol officer was already blocking off the perimeter of Margaret's property with bright yellow crime scene tape. Inside, other officers wearing gloves and crime scene gear were gathered around the open door of that tiny downstairs closet, while Howard sat in another room, his wife's arm wrapped around his shaking shoulders while she tried to comfort him. When Howard had tugged on his aunt's slipper, he had felt a foot still inside of it. Moments later, police would discover Margaret's body, all but naked, crammed inside of this little closet underneath the pile of clothes. Her head, face down, was wedged into the back corner of the closet, while her backside was up in the air, her knees bent underneath her at a sharp angle. Margaret was deceased, and based on the condition of her body, it was obvious she had been the victim of a violent homicide. Within hours of discovering Margaret's body, investigators were combing Margaret's property looking for clues, and it wasn't long before they found their first important piece of physical evidence. It was a single food service-type plastic glove with small traces of blood on it, and it looked like someone had recently dropped it in Margaret's backyard. But other than this glove, which was quickly sent off for testing, the police did not find anything else on the property that could help explain what had happened to Margaret or who was responsible for the attack. While patrol officers spread out around Margaret's neighborhood to talk with residents about any unusual activity or people in the area, detectives began considering possible motives for the crime. At first, it seemed like this had been a robbery because Margaret's red wallet was missing, but it would turn out that wallet was the only thing missing from Margaret's house, and it only contained a little bit of cash and some credit cards that had not even been used since Margaret was last spotted on Thursday, April 5th. So with robbery more or less ruled out, police began to wonder if, Margaret had enemies that might want her dead. But everyone the police spoke with said the same thing. Margaret got along with everyone. No one would want to hurt her. And so, with no obvious motive or suspect, the police simply began investigating everyone who was close to Margaret. They started with Howard and Cindy, but they were both quickly ruled out using their cell phone data. Police would also speak to other family members and friends, and they too would all be quickly ruled out as well. But when they started interviewing neighbors and former neighbors, one person stood out. His name was David Klinkenbach, and even after moving from the house next to Margaret's to a new address 2 miles away, David had continued to be the person who checked up on Margaret most frequently. He'd stop by her house a couple of times a week, and he helped take care of her weekly trash collection, moving her garbage containers to and from the street on trash day. Right after Margaret's body had been discovered, police had actually called David's home because they had been told he was close with her and so they wanted to speak to him, but he had not answered. Instead, police found him right outside of her house, pacing around chain-smoking cigarettes and telling anyone who would listen that he was very nervous about his fingerprints being all over the inside of Margaret's home. When police spoke to him, he obsessively asked them how was the investigation going so far and what had they discovered inside of the house. So, feeling very suspicious of David, the police would bring him into the station for questioning, and pretty much right away, David began looking more and more suspicious. David seemed to have information about details of Margaret's death that had not been widely shared, like where exactly in her house she had been found and what she was wearing. And when answering police questions about how well he knew Margaret, David also surprised investigators with random comments on Margaret's appearance and the fact that, especially earlier in her life, she had been a very attractive woman. But by the end of Wednesday, April 11th, so 2 days after the discovery of Margaret's body, David would be ruled out as a suspect. The DNA results from the bloody glove that had been found in Margaret's backyard had come back, and the blood on them did not belong to David, nor did it belong to anyone the police had spoken with thus far. Additionally, Margaret's autopsy had come back, and her time of death was listed as sometime around Friday, April 6th, and the data from David's cell phone showed he was not near her property at that time. So now, with the residents of Wadsworth starting to press law enforcement for answers, police were forced to regroup and take a different approach to finding out who, in this quiet, pretty town, would have wanted to kill a seemingly harmless 98-year-old woman. The only thing that seemed even remotely promising as another possible lead were reports from neighbors that in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death, there had been a rash of minor car break-ins. Nothing very serious, just a few car owners who had told police that their unlocked vehicles had been rifled through and small items like change and dollar bills had been taken. But these crimes of opportunity made police wonder if the perpetrator had started to check for unlocked homes as well as unlocked cars. Maybe they had tried Margaret's front door, they had found it open, and before long, what started as a robbery turned into a murder. And when police started looking right around Margaret's house to see if around the time she was killed, had there been any car break-ins or had there been any other recent reports of suspicious or possibly criminal activity, they found something. A carjacking had been reported right near Margaret's house on April 8th, so this would have been 1 day before Margaret's body was found. So the police tracked down the person who owned the vehicle that had been stolen. The owner was a 50-year-old church worker named Paul Shalit. Police expected this interview to be fairly simple and straightforward, but it wasn't. When police visited Paul at his house and asked him to describe what happened, he came across as very nervous and evasive. He told investigators that he had been out driving and had seen a young man, maybe 18 or 19 years old, and he apparently was limping as he was walking down the sidewalk. And so Paul, being a good Samaritan, had slowed down and asked this young man if he needed help, and the young man had said yes, he did need help. So Paul said he had pulled his SUV over to the side of the curb and he had got out to help the injured young man. But as soon as Paul had climbed out of his vehicle and had begun walking around the back of the vehicle to make his way over to the sidewalk, apparently this young man had lunged and opened the passenger side door of Paul's SUV. He had leapt across the middle console into the driver's seat and then had sped off, leaving Paul stranded. However, this story didn't really make sense to police because, according to the report, Paul's car had been found almost immediately and right down the street, totally undamaged. And after police wrapped up this first interview with Paul, they would review security footage of the carjacking that had been captured by cameras on a nearby building, and they saw firsthand that Paul's story was just not lining up. The footage of the carjacking showed that there was this young man on the sidewalk near where Paul's car slowed and stopped, but the young man was not limping, and as soon as Paul had stopped his car next to the curb, he didn't get out of the vehicle. Instead, the young man approached the passenger side of the vehicle and appeared to be speaking into the window, presumably to Paul, and then after a couple of minutes, the young man climbed into the vehicle with Paul. And then a few minutes later, Paul would suddenly jump out of the car, and the car, with the young man still inside of it, would take off down the road. So the police went back to Paul's house to question him again, and when confronted with the security footage of the carjacking, Paul would eventually tell police the truth. It would turn out the carjacking actually started as an encounter that Paul had set up using the social networking site Grindr that caters to people who identify as gay, bi, trans, and queer. According to Paul, he and the young man had met as planned and had begun a sexual encounter inside of Paul's SUV. But then, according to Paul, the young man, quote, snapped. And then a few moments later, the young man had overpowered Paul, forcing him out of the car onto the road, and then the young man sped off, leaving Paul standing there in the middle of the street. And then when the car was recovered later that day down the road, the young man was not found. When asked by detectives to provide contact information for this young man/carjacker, Paul would tell them that he was so embarrassed about what had happened that he had actually deleted all remnants of this young man from his phone, meaning he had completely deleted his Grindr account and so could not recover it, and he also had deleted the contact information for this young man that he had stored directly on his phone. So with no way of finding or identifying this carjacker, the police were forced to just wait and hope this mystery carjacker eventually turned up. A few days later, on Friday, April 13th, roughly 1 week after Margaret was killed, the Wadsworth police got a call from a local construction site reporting that someone had broken into one of their trailers. When investigators arrived at the scene of the break-in, the first thing they did was search the area. And behind the trailer that had been broken into was a cell phone lying in the dirt. The police would quickly unlock the phone and discover that its owner was a teenage boy whose name was already very familiar to Wadsworth police, Zach Thronson. Zach was a troubled young man who had previously gotten in trouble for petty theft as well as breaking into people's cars. And so naturally, the police thought Zach not only must have robbed this construction site, but almost certainly had to be the mystery carjacker they were looking for. And if that was true, maybe Zach had something to do with Margaret's murder. When police tracked Zach down, they found him asleep in his car in the parking lot at a local high school, and when they looked in the driver's window at him, police immediately noticed that his knees were all cut up, and these cuts looked recent. Waking up to see police tapping on his car window, Zach was nervous as well as startled, but he quickly agreed to come into the police station to answer a few questions. Initially, Zach denied that he had anything to do with the break-in at the construction site, but once police showed him his cell phone and they told him where they had found it, Zach's shoulders slumped and his head fell forward as he gripped his knees, and he took a deep breath as he stared at the floor, and then when he looked up again at the detectives, Zach sighed and said, "Okay, yes, I was at the construction site last night." But when investigators asked him if he had also committed the carjacking 5 days earlier, Zach seemed to perk up and said, "No, I really have no idea about that. I definitely did not steal anyone's car." And when police dug into this and really put him on the spot about it because they didn't really believe him, Zach stuck to his story and said, "Look, I've committed other robberies, but not this one." The police eventually believed him and just asked him point blank, "Okay, well, did you have anything to do with Margaret's murder?" And at this, Zach became extremely emphatic that of course he had heard about the murder, everyone had, but no way. It had nothing to do with that. By this point, Zach was totally rattled by the seriousness of the questions he was being asked. And so, likely just as a way of making himself seem a little bit less guilty and less suspicious, Zach started to throw his 17-year-old friend, Gavin Ramsey, under the bus. Zach said that Gavin had not only participated in every crime that Zach had, including the construction site break-in the night before, but also Gavin was the mastermind behind all of the crimes. And so if the police were thinking a local criminal had anything to do with the murder, well, they shouldn't talk to Zach, they should talk to Gavin. And the police would do just that. And when Gavin came to the police station, he did not arrive alone. Sitting next to him in the interrogation room was his mother, Christine. Gavin was the second oldest of her 4 sons, and she knew he was a troublemaker. Over the last 10 years, she had on several occasions enrolled her son in counseling, but she wasn't really sure if it was having an effect. It wasn't long into Gavin's interview before Gavin, like Zach, admitted that he had done some small stuff. He'd taken a little money from some cars recently, and he'd probably been the subject of a few noise complaints from neighbors, but that was it. When he was told that his friend Zach had placed him at the scene of the much more serious crime of breaking into the trailer at the construction site, Gavin hung his head momentarily, but then looked up and said, "Okay, yes, I was involved in that incident too." But when investigators asked Gavin if he had been involved in the carjacking on April 8th, Gavin's demeanor completely changed. He'd seemed almost comfortable talking about the petty theft and even the construction site break-in. But at the mention of this carjacking, he suddenly began shifting in his chair and he leaned forward and he put his face in his hands. Gavin wasn't the only person in the room to have a strong reaction. After hearing about this carjacking, Gavin's mom looked at her son and said, "Carjacking? Really?" But once detectives began describing some of the details of the carjacking, how it had started with a sexual encounter between the carjacker and the victim, Paul, Christine suddenly became far less worried that her son had potentially committed a carjacking and now was just worried that he had been potentially sexually assaulted during the carjacking. It was at this point, when his mother was really starting to get upset, that Gavin actually asked one of the investigators if he could just speak to them alone for a few minutes. And so, reluctantly, his mother and a patrol officer who had been in the room as well would leave the room, and then once Gavin was alone with the detectives, he would admit that, yes, he was the mystery carjacker. However, he wanted to correct a detail about that story, and he didn't want his mother to hear it. He told the detectives that he had agreed to meet Paul that night, but Gavin was not there to have sex with him. Instead, he had created a fake profile on Grindr to lure a gay man into meeting him so that he could rob them, and Paul was just the guy who had agreed to meet up. As far as Gavin was concerned, any man agreeing to meet a young man like him deserved whatever they got. When police felt satisfied that they had all the information they could get about the carjacking, they asked Gavin point blank if he had anything to do with Margaret's murder. And Gavin was just as adamant as his friend Zach that of course he knew about the murder. Everybody did, but he had nothing to do with it. The carjacking was his worst crime. Eventually, the detectives felt like they had gotten all the information they could from Gavin, and so they called his mother back into the room so they could release him. When she came back inside, the police told her that she and her son were free to leave for now, but before they left, the police would like to have a look at Gavin's cell phone. There was some information on there that could confirm some of the things he had told them, and so could she, his guardian, sign a consent form allowing them to do that. Gavin did not like this idea, but his mother did. She signed the form, and then moments later, the police had Gavin's phone, and the teenager and his mother were walking out of the station. A few hours later, the police would unlock Gavin's phone, and they would somewhat unintentionally discover something that shocked them to their core. Based on what they found on Gavin's phone, and on evidence that police would uncover over the next 72 hours following their conversation with Gavin, here is a reconstruction of what happened to 98-year-old Margaret Douglas on the day she died, April 6, 2018. At about 2 a.m. in the early morning hours of Friday, April 6th, Margaret's murderer walked the short distance from his house to her house. The temperature outside had dropped to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was snowing lightly. Margaret's street was a quiet one, each house separated from the curb by a wide strip of grass and a sidewalk, each house separated from its neighbor by a driveway leading to a detached garage. As the murderer reached the edge of Margaret's property, he looked in all directions to make sure no one was watching him, and then he quickly slipped down her driveway around to her backyard. Once there, he stepped up to the back door and peered through the glass. Inside, he could just make out the gleam of the metal sink set into the counter on the kitchen wall opposite him. Then he quietly turned the knob with a gloved hand. As he had hoped, the door was open, and a moment later, the intruder had stepped inside, out of the falling snow and the chilly air. After pausing for a minute to let his hands warm up and to look around and get his bearings, the intruder pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. He tapped the screen and entered his password, then he opened his camera and began taking a video. With his phone out in front of him recording, he began walking noiselessly through the kitchen toward the dining room. As he walked, the camera picked up how dimly lit the house was, with the only lights being from a few night lights and from street lights shining in through uncurtained windows. With the camera still rolling, he walked through the dining room and into the cozy living room in the front of the house. And there, fast asleep on her favorite sofa, was Margaret. She was dressed in slippers, a nightgown, and robe, her white hair arranged in short, neat curls around her face. The intruder stood there quietly for a few minutes, just drinking in the sight of her through the lens of his camera. Then, moving soundlessly around the blue-carpeted room, he began taking a series of videos of Margaret from different angles and different vantage points, listening all the while to her gentle, steady breathing. He felt a rush of excitement as he imagined the moment when he would wake her up and she would see him standing there in her house in the dark for the first time. With that thought in mind, now standing off to the side behind a nearby armchair, the intruder made his first deliberate noise. A cough. He heard the rustle of fabric, and then, through the camera viewfinder of his phone, he saw Margaret wake up. Staring ahead out into the darkness of her familiar living room, Margaret seemed instantly aware that suddenly she was not alone. The camera picked up her scratchy whisper. "Is someone there?" As she turned her head in his direction, the intruder stepped out of his hiding place. As he did, his camera caught an image of Margaret's face, the look of shock and fear as she realized that she'd been right, that she wasn't alone, that someone was in the room with her. But before Margaret could raise herself from the couch, the intruder stepped closer to her. He wished there was some way to capture what he was about to do to her on camera, but for what he was about to do, he knew he needed two hands. And so he turned off his camera, he slipped his phone into his pocket, and then with both of his hands, he reached down and he grabbed Margaret and he pulled her off the couch and dumped her on the ground on her back. And then he stepped on top of her and then crouched down, straddling her chest, and then he reached down and he put two hands around her neck and he began to squeeze. He knew there were many other ways to kill someone, but he didn't want to use a weapon that would put distance between him and his victim. He wanted to be there up close when they died. He wanted to feel them when they died. And so with his hands wrapped around her neck, he began squeezing harder and harder and harder, and as he did, Margaret began to fight back. Even at 98 years old, Margaret was still strong and sturdy, her hands reaching up to pull his fingers away as she rolled from side to side, trying to get out from under her attacker. But he was just too strong, and he kept squeezing harder and harder. As soon as Margaret started to go limp from a lack of oxygen, the killer released her neck. Barely alive and barely breathing, Margaret had no strength left to try to get away, so she just laid there on her back, still. As she did, her killer, who was still straddling her chest, looked down at her with immense pleasure. Then he balled each of his gloved hands into fists and began punching her face over and over and over again. It was only after it was obvious that Margaret was already dead that her murderer finally leaned back and let his arms drop to his sides while he tried to catch his breath. Once his heart rate had slowed, Margaret's killer got back up onto his feet and then he dug his phone back out of his pocket. He removed most of Margaret's clothing and arranged her in various suggestive poses, taking more pictures and videos as he went, and finally taking a video of himself sexually abusing her corpse. It was almost 4 a.m. when the murderer finally noticed the time. He had been in Margaret's house now for 2 hours, and he needed to be back at his own house before 5 a.m. But before he could leave, he needed to hide all the evidence that he had been there, and that meant hiding Margaret's body. Looking around the room, he spotted a small closet just to the right of the front door. Dragging her body across the room, he opened the closet door, and pushing and shoving, he finally managed to cram her body into the tiny space. After covering her with clothes and the vacuum cleaner, the murderer shut the door on her. Before leaving, the killer looked around the house one more time and noticed Margaret's bright red wallet sitting on an end table. Moving quickly now, he stepped over to the table, he pocketed the wallet, and then he headed for the back door of the house. Once outside again, the killer pulled off his blood-smeared plastic gloves and stuffed them inside of his jacket pockets. Just a few minutes later, the murderer was slipping quietly back into his own bedroom, just 5 houses away. What he didn't realize is that one of his bloody gloves that he had stuffed into his pockets had actually fallen out and was now laying in Margaret's backyard. 1 week later, on Friday, April 13th, after Gavin and his mother had left the police station, Wadsworth police would unlock Gavin's cell phone, and as they began looking through it, they found a folder labeled Dark. And in this folder were all the horrific videos and pictures taken of Margaret and her home on the night she was killed. The person who took those pictures and those videos, and who killed Margaret, was 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey. 3 days later, on April 16th, Wadsworth police arrested Gavin and charged him with the murder. Inside Gavin's bedroom, investigators would find the other plastic glove that matched the one dropped at the crime scene, and forensic tests on both gloves would show that the DNA and bodily fluids on the gloves matched Gavin's. Police also found Margaret's red wallet, along with notebooks belonging to Gavin that detailed his desire to kill, along with his detailed handwritten research into the crimes and methods of famous serial killers. Digging into Gavin's personal history, investigators also discovered that in the year preceding Margaret's murder, Gavin had applied for work at a local funeral home. This fact would be significant in light of a later court-ordered psychiatric report that showed that Gavin found sex with corpses exciting. Police theorized that Gavin, who had once gone to Margaret's house to ask if he could help her out with some yard work, which she didn't hire him for, chose Margaret as his victim because of her advanced age and lack of home security. In November 2018, 7 months after Margaret's murder, Ohio state prosecutors won a legal ruling that would allow the videos and images from Gavin's cell phone to be used as evidence against him in a public trial where Gavin would be charged as an adult. In response to this ruling, Gavin avoided a public trial by pleading no contest to 9 charges that included aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse. Although Gavin's mother, Christine, told the judge at a sentencing hearing on January 4, 2019, that Gavin's aggressive behavior and poor judgment were caused by his pediatrician misprescribing the antidepressant Zoloft that Gavin was taking at the time of the murder, the judge ultimately sentenced Gavin to life in prison at Grafton Correctional Institution, an adult facility located 40 minutes to the northwest of Wadsworth. On Monday, April 16th, the same day that Gavin was arrested and charged with the murder, 98-year-old Margaret Douglas was laid to rest right beside her husband Donald on a quiet grassy slope in the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. On her headstone, it just reads, "In God's hands, in our hearts." Just after midnight on April 4, 2013, a man stepped out of his tent into the pitch-black woods of central Maine. He was wearing a wool hat, he had a nice brand new Columbia jacket on, some Land's End jeans, and some high-quality boots. He was carrying a backpack as well as another bag that contained a screwdriver along with some other tools. He adjusted his glasses and then looked up into the sky, and it was so dark he couldn't even see the moon, and he thought to himself, perfect. He turned and began quickly walking away from his tent into this forest where the trees were so dense that if you weren't careful, you could actually get stuck in between 2 trees. And scattered all over the ground were these huge slippery boulders covered in moss where one wrong step and you're breaking an ankle. But despite the rugged terrain and zero visibility, this man was able to easily navigate this area as if he had memorized every step. After an hour of silent hiking, he reached this huge pond called North Pond, and while staying hidden in the trees, he followed the shoreline until he reached the edge of the forest overlooking this clearing. And right in front of him were dozens of cabins overlooking this pond. This was Pine Tree Summer Camp. He waited in the tree line for a few minutes just listening to make sure nobody was out there, even though he knew their schedule and knew no one was there. After not hearing anything and feeling like the coast was clear, he stepped out of the woods and walked up to the top of the camp to the dining hall, and he made his way around to the back door. There, he pulled a screwdriver out of his bag and expertly popped open the lock and stepped inside. Once he was inside, he pulled out his tiny flashlight and he made his way over to the pantry where he began stuffing his bag full of candy, chips, and coffee. Once his bag was almost completely full, he walked over to the walk-in freezer, he went into his pocket and pulled out a key that he had stolen on a previous trip. He unlocked the lock, went inside, he grabbed some frozen hamburger patties and hot dogs, and then he left the freezer and locked it behind him. He did one more pass through the pantry and grabbed some more candy off the shelves and jammed them into his pockets, and then after feeling satisfied that he had all he could take, he decided it was time to leave. And so as he made his way to the door, he thought to himself, great, another successful raid complete. Or so he thought. A motion detector had recently been installed inside of the dining hall behind the ice machine. As soon as this man had pried open the back door, it had picked him up and remained silent, but sent an alarm to the nearby home of Sergeant Terry Hughes, who was a game warden that was investigating recent thefts in the area. Terry sped to the camp in under 4 minutes, and he parked his truck a ways away from the dining hall because he was worried he would scare off the perpetrator. So he parked his car and ran on foot, staying in the tree line until he got right behind the dining hall. He ran up to the back door and looked in the window, and he saw this tall, skinny man walking out of the walk-in freezer. And this guy did not look towards Terry. Instead, he turned and walked farther away from him over towards the pantry. This guy pulls a flashlight out, he shines it at one of the shelves, and he takes some things off the shelf and puts them in his pockets. And then after standing there for a minute, the man turns off his flashlight, faces Terry, and begins walking towards the back door. At this point, Terry backs off the window and goes behind a tree that's overlooking the back door. He gets his flashlight in one hand and he unholsters his pistol and he waits. Terry watched as this man barely opened the back door. He slinked out the crack and then he began walking into the woods. And at that point, Terry leapt out, shined the light in his face, drew his pistol and told him to get on the ground. The man didn't resist. He immediately got on the ground, and Terry called the state police, who were there only a couple minutes later. They arrested this guy and put him on a chair, and then they began interviewing him. They asked him what his name was, and the man just remained silent. And so they searched him, but they couldn't find any form of identification, and so they asked him again, "What's your name?" And the guy again didn't say anything. So the officers decided to remove his handcuffs and give him a bottle of water, and then see if he would talk. And sure enough, he did. His speech was slow and awkward and kind of abrupt, like he had not spoken in a really long time. He told them his name was Christopher Knight and that he had been born on December 7th, 1965. He said he didn't have an address, he didn't have a vehicle, and he had never filed a tax return. He told them he lived in a tent in the woods nearby. They asked him how long he had been doing that for, and he paused for a minute and then said, "When was the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster?" And the officers looked at each other and they were like, 1986. And he's like, "Yeah, that's when I went in the woods." And they were like, "That was 27 years ago." And Chris said, "Yeah." The officers asked him, well, 27 years is a long time. You got to be out there with some other people. Is your family out here? You got a girlfriend? You got, some sort of companion out there with you? And Chris said, "No, I live out there alone." And in fact, the last time I had a conversation with another person besides now was in 1990 when I happened to walk past another hiker and we both just said hi to each other. Besides that, for 27 years, it's just been me. And it would turn out Chris wasn't kidding, and he went to great lengths to ensure he stayed completely cut off from the rest of society. Despite winter temperatures dropping to negative 20 degrees, he refused to light a fire in fear of giving away his camp. And so instead, when it got that cold, he would just stay up all night pacing around his camp, trying to stay warm that way. He never even talked to himself or sang out loud because he was so worried someone might hear him, and he never left his campsite unless it was basically pitch black on an overcast night because he was afraid of being seen. When the officers asked him if he had access to the internet at least, he said, I haven't seen the internet. Chris wound up confessing to over 1,000 burglaries over the 27 years he had been out in the woods. He said he was ashamed of it, but originally when he had moved out into the woods, he had tried to hunt for his own food and forage for his own food, but he was terrible at it, so he had to resort to theft. He said he only robbed cabins and homes when he was certain no one was there, which meant sometimes going a long period of time between meals. And the food he did find made for a terrible diet. He mostly ate junk food and candy because it was stuff that was easy to find and kept fairly well. When asked why he had moved into the woods in the first place, he didn't really have an answer. Although in a later interview, he would say that growing up, human interaction had always been very difficult for him, and when he was in the woods, he just felt kind of content and at peace. When Chris's story broke, the residents around North Pond were shocked. For decades, they had swapped stories about someone or something haunting the area. Propane tanks, food, batteries, clothes, books would all go missing. They were starting to get scared, especially when it was overcast at night, because they knew that was when this person would come out. But despite staying up at night with their weapons out ready to confront whoever it was doing this, they never found him. And the police were repeatedly called to come in and try to solve this mystery, but they couldn't figure it out either. As the incidents mounted, the Phantom was given a name, the North Pond Hermit. When Chris was finally arrested and some of his life story was leaked to the media, residents of North Pond were torn on how to feel about him. Some people thought he was purely a criminal, that he was a thief, and that not only had he stolen their physical property, he'd also stolen their peace of mind and their sanity. Others idolized him like he was some cult hero. He was a man that rejected what society says makes us happy: careers, relationships, material comforts, yet he was happy. But regardless of how residents felt about his lifestyle, the one thing they could all agree on was how incredible it was that he survived for as long as he did. Winters in Maine are notoriously brutal and cold. A week of winter camping would be considered a huge accomplishment, let alone an entire season. That was totally unheard of, and Chris did entire seasons 27 years in a row. Ultimately, Chris was sentenced to 7 months in prison. When he was released, he was given 3 years of probation, and part of the conditions for his release is that every week he would have to go physically check in with the judge, which meant he would not be able to just escape back into the woods again. When his probation did finally end, he did not go running back into the woods. He decided to remain in society. In an interview, Christopher was asked what he learned from these 27 years in total isolation. What have you learned about the human experience? What did you learn about yourself? Tell us, because you have knowledge that virtually none of us will ever have access to. And apparently he just paused, thought about it for a second, and then looked up at the interviewer and said, "Make sure you get enough sleep." And then he got up and walked away. While we don't know exactly what Chris is up to these days, people that know him say he lives by himself in a small apartment, he has a regular job, and he values his privacy over everything else. Our next story is called Guardian Angel. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, "You know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal, just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave." And so Deborah said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream." And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed. She's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, "Honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now." And her husband did not want to go. And he said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She said, "Get out of bed. We're leaving right now." And so begrudgingly, her husband said, "Okay, we'll leave right now." And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence. And then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal, and at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it, and she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, "Hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah at this point is now terrified, and she's saying, "No, keep going, don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there, and they're going to lure us in, and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her." And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot, and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car, and they'll be out in a couple of minutes, and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road. The police came up on their side and they said, "Yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side." And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight. And then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn. And so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road and they stopped next to Deborah's car and they said, you know what, guys, we didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the 2 responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asks them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend. And when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the terrain kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But, according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact, 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bullion Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle-of-the-night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Missing Patients. On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old father of 6 named Tatike Katsai arrived at a hospital in Stellenbosch, which is one of the richest towns in South Africa. Tatike, who lived in the area with his family, had been dealing with some stomach issues over the last several months, and so this day he was finally going in to have abdominal surgery to hopefully alleviate those issues. So, after entering the building, Tatike was checked in, and then before long he was transferred to the operating room where surgeons got to work on him. After the surgery was over, Tatike was transferred to a recovery room in the hospital where he was scheduled to stay for at least a couple of days so the doctors and nurses could watch over him while he recovered and make sure there was no complications from the procedure. And so, on the afternoon of October 4th, Tatike just kind of lounged around inside of his recovery room. He couldn't really do anything because of the incisions on his stomach, and so he mostly just laid in his bed, he watched TV, he relaxed, he ate, and then at some point, some of his family members came into the hospital and they visited with him as well. By the end of that day, the day of his surgery, Tatike was definitely sore from the incisions, but overall, he was in good spirits, and to the medical staff, it seemed very likely that his surgery was a success. Early the next morning, at around 5:15 a.m., one of the nurses in the hospital went to Tatike's room to check on him. And when she went inside, Tatike was awake, he was alert, he seemed totally normal. And so after a brief conversation, the nurse told Tatike that she was just going to get him some fresh linens to make up his bed. And so Tatike nodded a thank you to her, and then the nurse, she turned away from Tatike, who's in his bed. She stepped out of the one door in the room into the hallway, she grabbed fresh linens off of a cart, and then she turned back around and went back into Tatike's room, except now Tatike was not in his bed. So the nurse immediately thought, okay, well then Tatike must have gone into his bathroom because the door was shut. He must be in the bathroom. And so just kind of reflexively, the nurse walked over to Tatike's now empty bed and replaced the linens. And then when she was done, she just looked at the bathroom door inside of his room, expecting Tatike to come outside any minute. But after a couple of minutes passed and Tatike had still not come out of the bathroom, the nurse decided to go over and just knock. And so she walked over, she knocked on the bathroom door and just kind of called out, hey, is everything okay in there? But there was no answer. And so the nurse eventually just tried the handle, and when she saw it was open, she called out that she was coming inside, she opened up the bathroom door, and it was empty. And so the nurse, she whipped her head around and looked back out at the room where Tatike should have been. And she saw, he's not on the bed, he's not under the bed, he's not anywhere in this room. Where could he have possibly gone? And she's thinking to herself, the only door out of this room is into the hallway, the same door that she had used to go out and get the linens. And if somehow Tatike had ran out of that door in the few seconds that her back was turned from Tatike, she certainly would have heard him or seen him. Because again, she was right outside the door and only outside of his room for a couple of seconds. Not to mention the fact, Tatike has major incisions on his stomach and could barely stand, let alone walk or run. And so totally baffled, this nurse ultimately left the room and went and told her superiors. This hospital would immediately begin looking for Tatike on the grounds of the hospital, but they would do it kind of quietly. They wouldn't call Tatike's family to tell them that, hey, we can't find him, nor would they call police. And some have speculated that either one, the hospital did not think this was an emergency and they would quickly find Tatike and that everything would be fine, or two, the hospital was just so embarrassed at the idea that they lost a patient, they didn't want anyone to know, and so that's why they didn't tell anyone. Regardless, the hospital would search for Tatike all day on the 5th, the day he went missing, and they wouldn't find him. And then the next day, the 6th, the hospital again would spend the entire day quietly searching everywhere in the hospital, but they wouldn't find him again. And so finally on the next day, the 7th, so 48 hours after Tatike had just kind of vanished inside of his room, the hospital would reach out to Tatike's family and they would say to them, hey, is Tatike home with you guys? And the family was like, no, he's supposed to be with you. And so the hospital would say, well, he left 2 days ago, so we don't know where he is. And so Tatike's family is horrified, not only that they were totally left in the dark, but they would find out over the course of this conversation that the hospital had not even contacted the police yet. And so the family, they reached out to the police, and then later that day, the family would meet the police at the Stellenbosch hospital, and then a very public search of the property would ensue to look for Tatike. However, again, no one could find him. Authorities would continue to search both the hospital and also the neighboring area outside of the hospital over the next couple of days, but after they continued to find absolutely nothing, the search began to wind down. And so Tatike's devastated family was left with absolutely no idea what to think or what to do. Fast forward to October 20th, so 15 days after Tatike had gone missing. And on this day, the 20th, there was a construction crew at this hospital in Stellenbosch doing some renovations. And at some point on this day, one of the workers had to climb into the ceiling of one of the floors of this hospital. Now, the space above the ceiling is this tight, cramped space, almost like an attic. It's very big and wide. It's like the whole length of that floor. And really the only people that would ever go into the ceiling are construction workers or other authorized personnel that needed to do work. It's not a place that the public would ever go into. But when one of these workers went up into the ceiling, he had a headlamp on and he's kind of looking around. He's looking for what he needs to do up there. And at some point he turns his head and his light illuminates a person sitting in the corner far away from him, way up against the side in this tiny little attic space. And it would turn out it was Tatike, and he was deceased. The hospital had absolutely no clue how Tatike could have gotten up there. Not only is it obviously not a publicly accessible area, but the actual way to get up into the ceiling, the door that leads up into the ceiling, is very difficult to find. And even if Tatike found this entrance into the ceiling, it would have been nearly impossible for him to actually get into the ceiling. Because again, this guy has serious incisions on his stomach from the surgery he got. He could barely sit up. He couldn't really walk. So the idea of him climbing and pulling himself up into the ceiling just seems impossible. Then there was the very strange autopsy results. Now, the full report has not been made public, but Tatike's family had a consultation with the hospital after the autopsy was complete, and they would go to reporters and talk about what the hospital told them. And apparently, the hospital told the family that Tatike did not die from complications from his surgery, and they heavily insinuated that Tatike did not die from natural causes. Something happened to him, and the hospital had no idea what this something was, and that's what killed him. And the hospital also told the family that Tatike likely was dead before he went up into the ceiling. Meaning someone or something killed Tatike, and then someone or something placed him in the ceiling. Again, this is just from the family going to reporters and talking about their discussion with the hospital. The hospital's only official statement has basically been that they have cooperated with the family and they don't really know what happened to Tatike. Now, of course, this is a very strange story, but it gets even weirder. On May 10th, 2019, so about a year and a half after Tatike was found deceased in the Stellenbosch hospital ceiling, a 53-year-old father of 4 named Sandile Sibiya arrived at another hospital in South Africa. It was in a city called Durban, which is considered to be one of the nicest and wealthiest places in South Africa, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandile was a builder, and he had been working on a house when he had fallen and broken his leg. Specifically, he broke his femur bone, the bone that runs from your hip down to your knee, the big single bone in your thigh. So just for reference, if you break your femur, you can't walk. So with some assistance from friends and family, Sandile hobbled his way into this hospital in Durban, and he began to receive care. 2 days later, on May 17th, Sandile was still in the hospital, still recovering from this broken femur, when his cousin came to visit him. The cousin said Sandile seemed totally normal, and that during this visit, Sandile told the cousin that after the cousin left, Sandile was going to be transported from this hospital to another hospital nearby, where he was going to get an x-ray of his leg, as well as talk to another orthopedic surgeon. But apparently, after this cousin left from this visit, the doctors at the Durban hospital walked into Sandile's room to take him and transport him to this other hospital, and Sandile was not in his room. Now, this hospital in Durban was known for their very tight security, and so right away, their reaction was very different than the Stellenbosch hospital's reaction. This hospital immediately contacted authorities and said, "We are missing a patient," and they began a very public search of their hospital for Sandile. But they couldn't find him. On May 18th, so 6 days after Sandile disappeared, the hospital in Durban began to smell this horrible stench coming from one wing of their hospital. And so hospital workers would track the stench to a janitor's closet, and when they opened it up, they saw this black liquid dripping out of the ceiling, and the liquid was coming from Sandile's decomposing body that was located in the ceiling.
Sandil's autopsy would be carried out very quickly. However, the results of that autopsy have never been made public, and Sandil's family has not commented on the results of this autopsy. As of today, all we know is that within a 2-year period, 2 seemingly ordinary South African men, who both could either not walk at all or who could barely walk because of their physical injuries, somehow snuck out of their hospital rooms totally undetected by staff and then wound up dead in the hospital ceiling. Some say the men really did somehow sneak out of their own accord and decided to go into the ceiling, and that's what happened. Others say both men were murdered and then placed into the ceiling, and still others think these 2 cases are the best examples of something called spontaneous teleportation, which is the hypothetical phenomenon where a human suddenly disappears and then almost instantaneously reappears in another location. But for now, there is no official explanation, so those are all just theories. And so it's up to you to decide what you believe.
On the morning of September 23, 1839, an experienced sailor named Captain Brighton stood on the deck of his ship, which was traveling through the Drake Passage, which is located right along the northern coast of Antarctica. He and his crew had sailed here because they were professional whalers, and they had heard there was this massive population of whales in the Drake Passage that basically were untouched by humanity because basically nobody sailed this far. This was a freezing cold, very austere part of the world, kind of a dangerous place to be. But so far, Captain Brighton and his crew had not seen a single whale. And on top of that, the Drake Passage had proven to be as dangerous as expected. Just the previous night, the ocean around the ship had literally frozen, basically anchoring the ship in place. And so when this happened, Captain Brighton realized there was nothing they could even do about this. I mean, they were stuck. And if this didn't break up soon, they'd be stuck here all winter potentially, and it was unclear if they could actually survive that. But fortunately, also the previous night, this massive storm rolled in, which, that's dangerous in and of itself. But the severity of the storm was actually a good thing because it broke up the ice around the ship and allowed Captain Brighton to sail away. And so now, that morning, the ocean was again, liquid, so they were able to move around. But Captain Brighton had a very difficult decision to make. Again, so far, they have not caught any whales, and they've invested a lot of time and money to get out here. But, if he stayed out here much longer, he knew they could potentially get stranded again, and he just couldn't let that happen. And so he needed to decide if he was going to keep on sailing further into the Drake Passage to maybe find a couple whales, or leave now before it was too late. But as Captain Brighton weighed his options, he suddenly noticed something over the horizon. There was this dark shape. And at first, he actually thought he was hallucinating, because really, there's nothing else out here. It's just him and ocean and ice. That was it. But as he continued to stare in the direction of this dark object, which was actually getting closer to him, he realized it was a real thing, and in fact, it was another ship, which was really surprising, because again, nobody really comes out here. And so his instincts were, okay, this has got to be a rival whale ship. I mean, that's the only other people who would come out here. But as he continued to stare at the ship, as it got closer, he realized it was not a whale ship. It was actually a schooner, which is a ship designed for traveling. But as Captain Brighton stared at the schooner that was getting closer and closer, he saw it was in pretty rough shape. I mean, the hull and the sails were very tattered. I mean, there was something off about the ship. But Captain Brighton was thinking, hey, I know you can get trapped in the ice out here. It happened to them the night before. Maybe this crew has gotten trapped in the ice. They've been stuck out here for who knows how long. They could be in pretty rough shape. And Captain Brighton knew they actually did have, at least at that moment, quite a bit of supplies, at least some to spare. And so he called out to his men to ready a dinghy and get some supplies because they were gonna go over to this schooner and basically offer up some extra supplies and also check in on them and make sure they were okay. And so once the supplies were packaged up and put on the dinghy, Captain Brighton, along with 4 other men, hopped in the dinghy and they began paddling over to the schooner. And as they got closer, the waves were pretty bad. And so they're kind of jostling around and, the ship itself, the schooner is also moving. And so that's moving up and down. But, periodically as they got closer, they'd be able to look into the portholes, which are like windows on the side of the schooner. And Captain Brighton could clearly see there were people inside of the schooner. He called out a few times, but it was windy and sort of loud, and he couldn't really tell if any of them heard him or if anybody called back. And so eventually, Captain Brighton and his crew, they got to the side of the schooner and they just climbed up the ladder and boarded the ship. And once they were on the ship, once they were on the deck of the schooner, they're looking around and everything was in working order, albeit sort of tattered and in rough shape. But the weird thing is nobody was out on deck. They had seen people in the portholes, which was inside the ship, but there was nobody above deck. And so Captain Brighton's thinking, okay, this is pretty weird here, but we clearly just need to go inside and talk to someone. And so Captain Brighton and his men walked across the deck to this door that led into the ship. It actually led into the captain's quarters, at least, based on basic ship construction, that's what they expected it to be. And so Captain Brighton, he gets to the door, he knocks and calls out, announces that they're here with supplies and just to make sure everybody is okay. But there's no answer. All they can hear is the slapping of the water against the ship. There's no voices, there's nothing. It's silent on the ship. And so Captain Brighton eventually just opens up this door, and sure enough, he looks into this dark space, and it's the captain's quarters. And there's a desk towards the back of this room, and there's a man sitting at the desk with his back to them. And so Captain Brighton, he takes a cautious step into the captain's quarters and he calls out to this man who clearly appears to be the captain. But the man doesn't say or do anything. He's clearly focused on something at his desk. And so Captain Brighton exchanged a worried glance with his men and then just decided he would walk across the room and go physically interact with this guy and make sure he was okay and see what was going on here. And so slowly, Captain Brighton began walking across the room, and as he did, he called out a few more times to this man who appeared to be the captain, but he didn't get a response. And then finally, he was right behind the man, and he actually looked down and read what the man had been writing. This is what it said. "Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains." However, as unsettling as that would be to read for anybody in this situation, what was the most unsettling part was actually what was written right above that journal entry. The date, January 17th, 1823, 16 years before. That captain and his entire crew were all dead and had been for 16 years. They got trapped in the ice just like Captain Brighton had, but it didn't break up. They were stranded and they all froze to death. And because it was so cold out in that part of the world, all their bodies were basically preserved in their final moments. And so the captain of the ship, before he died, was making an entry to say what happened. And then down below, when Captain Brighton and his men went to go look, they found people playing cards who had literally frozen to death while playing cards. They found a woman lying in her bed with her dog. That's how they froze to death. They found people in the dining hall and they died right where they were sitting. It was like all these people had been frozen in time for nearly 2 decades, just floating around in Drake's Passage. And basically nobody had found them until Captain Brighton. On the night of May 20th, 1958, a young man named Ram Thapa walked towards the entrance of an abandoned airport in eastern India. He was trailing behind 3 other men. They were his boss, another employee of his boss, and then a friend of his boss. It was pitch black outside, and so all 4 men had flashlights. But Ram also had something else. He had a huge knife. So the reason they were there is Ram's boss was considering buying this airport. However, there were these rumors floating around that this airport was now haunted ever since being abandoned. In fact, people said, the old hangars and rusted out buildings were infested with ghosts. Now, Ram totally believed that this place really was haunted, but Ram's boss wanted to go and check it out, before he actually considered really buying this place. And so he had recruited these 3 other guys, Ram included, to go basically on a ghost hunt. And so going into this, Ram's boss and the 2 other men, they're sort of like, okay, this is intriguing. It's kind of funny that we're going on this ghost hunt. But Ram, he was terrified. He did not like the idea of going into this airport, especially at night. I mean, he fully believed there were ghosts out here. I mean, he had brought the knife along to protect himself from ghosts. But his boss was basically telling him that he had to go, and so Ram was there. And so Ram's boss reached the gate, he unlocked it, and pushed it open. And as it slowly swung open, it made this horrible creaking sound, and for the first time, all 4 men are getting an unobstructed view into the actual property.
And it's totally, again, pitch black, and they're shining their lights inside, and all they see are just these old hangars and different big buildings and broken down planes, but there's no movement. It's totally dark and it's quiet. And so Rom's boss and the other two men, they're walking along, and Rom's in the back, and he's so uneasy, he feels practically sick to his stomach. I mean, everywhere he looked, he would think that he saw a shadow, a ghost staring back at him, but he would shine the light and, nothing would be there. And so this whole time they're walking, he's totally on edge. And eventually they reached the actual runway. And when they got there, instead of shining their lights kind of straight out in front of them, because there was basically nothing out ahead of them, it was just, where planes go to take off and to land, they began shining their lights predominantly off to the side, where there was this huge hangar, and they were all shining their lights in the different windows to see if, anybody was inside of there. And so they're all kind of focused off to the side, and Rom, the whole time, he's totally terrified here. And as, his boss and his friends are kind of shining their lights over here, Rom takes his flashlight and he aims it straight out in front of them. And he sees maybe a couple 100 meters away, just off to the side of the runway, is what appears to be this floating orb. And immediately he keeps his light trained on this orb, and he signals to his boss and the others like, hey, look at this. And they all turn, and they're kind of like, joking around, and they shine their light, and they also see it. They see this floating orb. It made no sense. They noticed that there was not just this orb of light, but there was something below the orb of light, like on the ground. Something was moving, this grayish figure, or multiple figures were kind of like moving around right beneath this orb. But before any of them could say or do anything or react really in any way to whatever it was they were looking at, the dark figures right below the orb, as they're being illuminated by all their flashlights, it was like all of a sudden, whatever they were, they turned, and all these eyes glinted and looked directly back at Rom and his colleagues. And it was like something inside of Rom just clicked. He was so scared. He'd been terrified from the moment they got here, and the whole time he had been so primed to protect himself if he had to with this knife. And it was like when he saw these eyes, he didn't have any idea what they were, but he knew they were evil, and if he didn't act, they were doomed. And so, without saying anything to his boss or the other two men, with knife in hand, Rom took off running towards the figures. A few hours later, Rom and his colleagues were no longer at the airport. Instead, they were at the police station, and Rom was in handcuffs. It would turn out those figures that they spotted that Rom went to go confront with his knife were not actually ghosts. Instead, they were 3 women who had come onto the airfield as well, but just to pick flowers. That orb of light that the men had seen was just their lantern. Rom had been so convinced they were ghosts that he had taken off and attacked them with his knife, believing he was not only protecting himself, but protecting his boss and the other 2 men. However, he had been wrong. These were just women, and he killed one of them and severely wounded the other 2. And so ultimately, he was charged with murder and assault. However, when he went on trial, he was actually acquitted of all charges because the jury genuinely believed that Rom actually thought he was attacking ghosts, not people. On April 9th, 2005, in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, a young man was home alone inside of his apartment watching TV. And as he sat there watching TV, he heard a loud thumping sound coming from right above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and he listened for a second, and a minute later, he heard it again, a loud thump. And then he heard another one, and another one, and another one, and before long, all he heard was a succession of thumps and also what sounded like chanting coming from upstairs. However, as unusual as these types of sounds might be to the average person, to this young man, these actually weren't that weird. Because the family that lived right above him, the Wu family, were pretty eccentric. They were very religious people who often did these ceremonial dances and rituals at all hours, and a lot of times they involved stomping around and chanting really loudly. And as annoying as that could be, this young man never complained. He was very respectful of the Wu family, and he knew, these sounds he was hearing were connected to their religion, and he felt like that was none of his business. And so, like he did basically every other time he would hear these noises, he simply turned the volume up on his TV and tried to forget about them. But after a few minutes, it was like the noises coming from upstairs just kept getting louder and louder and louder until it was basically impossible to ignore. And then suddenly he heard a scream coming from upstairs that certainly did not feel attached to a ceremony. It sounded like somebody was in danger or in trouble or something. And so at that point, the young man turned the TV off and he stood up and he thought, I need to go up there and make sure things are okay. I mean, forget being annoyed. It sounds like, someone's in trouble or someone's hurt or something. But as he began making his way towards his door to go upstairs and check on the Wu family, all the noises just completely stopped and it was silent upstairs. And at that point, the young man just stopped where he was. And for a minute, he just listened, waiting to see if maybe the noises would pick back up again. But they didn't. And so the young man just turned around, walked back to his seat, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, that same young man was back home all alone, watching TV yet again, when, once again, he heard a loud pounding sound. Except this time, it was not coming from upstairs, it was coming from his front door. Somebody was hammering on his front door trying to get his attention. And so the young man turned off the TV, he got up, and he went over to his door, he opened it up, and standing there on the landing was this middle-aged man named Wu Shan, who was the patriarch of the Wu family upstairs. And Wu Shan looked absolutely horrible. He was dressed all in black head to toe, but he was pale and skinny and very gaunt, and he was covered in what looked like filth, like food and ash, and he smelled unbelievably horrible. And the young man, he asked Wu Shan, hey, is everything okay? And remember, the young man's thinking about that crazy, loud ceremony they had just 2 days earlier, wondering, whatever happened with that? That was so loud. But Wu Shan just looked back at the young man with this kind of vacant expression. And he just said, call an ambulance. And then, without saying anything else, Wu Shan turned, ran down the steps, and disappeared out into the street. And so at this point, the young man is left just standing there having no idea what to think. I mean, Wu Shan did not look well and he's now run away. And again, this young man is thinking about that bizarre ritual he overheard a couple of days ago that just kind of stopped abruptly after screams were heard. Now he's being told to call an ambulance. And so he's thinking, I better go upstairs and make sure things are okay before I do anything else. And so the young man left his apartment, went upstairs to the Wu family's apartment, and the door was shut. But even standing outside the door, he began to smell that same absolutely horrible smell that he smelled on Wu Shan. And so he knocks on the Wu family's door, he's kind of covering his nose, but he doesn't get a response, nobody comes to the door. And so after looking around, he just tried the doorknob and he found it was unlocked. So, pretty apprehensively, but knowing he needed to see what was going on here, he opened up the door and right away he's hit with another wave of just this disgusting smell. He can barely breathe, but nonetheless, he steps into the house and he calls out to anybody, anyone come over here and tell me what's going on. But nobody called back. And he kind of looked around the family's apartment and it was totally filthy. There was just this grime all over everything. And he made his way all the way into the living room. And there he stopped, because in the middle of the living room on the floor, he saw something that he just simply couldn't believe. It would turn out the Wu family had performed a ritual 2 days earlier. That was the sounds that the neighbor downstairs had been hearing. Those loud stomping and screaming, all that stuff was a ceremony like the family was known to do. However, that ceremony got totally out of hand. So in the weeks leading up to that ceremony, one of the Wu family's daughters came down with an illness. And because the family didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't send her to the doctor. And after a couple of days, when she didn't get better, the family decided that, okay, well, she must not be physically sick. She must be spiritually sick, meaning she was possessed by a demon. And so at first, they tried some ceremonies to ward off this demon, but it wasn't really working. And then before long, the rest of the members of the family began complaining that maybe they too were also possessed by the same demon. And before long, that was the belief that the entire Wu family shared, that they all were possessed by demons. And so on the day the downstairs neighbor heard all that stomping and chanting and screaming, that was the day that the Wu family performed a big group exorcism to try to get rid of these demons once and for all from all of them. But the way they did this exorcism was truly horrifying. They believed that the one thing demons were afraid of was filth. And so they decided that if they filled their bodies with enough filth, the demons would leave. And so the Wu family, as they chanted and stomped around and screamed, began consuming their own feces. And when they would vomit it back up again, they would just swallow it right back down for hours and hours and hours. What the downstairs neighbor actually discovered inside the living room of the Wu family's apartment was the daughter, the one who originally had gotten sick, and she was laying on the ground and was deceased. And during the autopsy, they would discover that her airway was totally blocked by feces and vomit. By the time the downstairs neighbor made this discovery, the entire Wu family had fled the apartment. Wu Shan had disappeared after saying calling an ambulance, and the rest of the family too had kind of run off. But the police would ultimately track down all the remaining Wu family members, and they would all be arrested. However, a court ultimately decided that the Wu family was suffering from something known as mass hysteria, and as a result of that, they could not be held legally accountable for what they did. And so, they were all acquitted. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting.